The presentation is looking at growth management in Louisiana, developing guidelines for local, regional, and state policy to guide growth, invest efficiently, and support more livable communities. This project was supported from a grant, both through the University Transportation Center program at LSU, as well as the Louisiana Transportation Research Center, as well as our own Transportation Institute put in a portion of the funding for this. So the three different entities supported the funding for this project. So just to give you a quick overview, I'll start with a project summary, problem statement, moving into background, best practices, and context. Then Tara will talk about stakeholder involvement and feedback, and then we'll get into modeling potential, what we did with that. We were able to hire some of the really leading experts in the country and talk a little bit about how we incorporated their expertise into this project, and then looking at conclusions and recommendations. So to begin, the problem statement for this project is that growth in and around many urban areas in Louisiana is not consistently managed or planned. This can negatively impact state and local governments' ability to meet current and future demand for transportation infrastructure, particularly with respect to DOTD's Complete Streets policy. Better tools and policies for coordinating infrastructure investment with development to encourage safe, efficient, sustainable, and multimodal transportation systems are needed. So I'll say that this study is not a unique problem to Louisiana. This is a problem that we see across the United States, that we have, particularly in an era of fiscal constraint, where we have a lot of transportation infrastructure and we have growing demand for the development of land. And they are typically not coordinated. The coordination of land use and transportation planning is often talked about, but it's very challenging to do that because of how we have set up our state and local agencies on how that happens. I actually chair the Transportation Research Board Standing Committee on Transportation and Land Development. And I talk a lot about these issues and look at research on these issues across the country. The problem really comes down to a simple fact. Local governments have land use jurisdiction to approve or deny land development, and transportation investments, particularly in roads and highways, are often made by a state-level agency, typically a Department of Transportation. So there's very few mechanisms for being able to coordinate those together in any sort of institutional way. So the research questions that we looked at is, what are the current state of practice in statewide growth management policy? So what's happening with all that I'm kind of talking about nationally and locally? What tools, policies, or programs should Louisiana consider implementing at the state and/or local level to achieve more efficient, integrated land use and transportation outcomes, and to encourage livable, economically vital communities? And three, how will the implementation of growth management guidelines proposed impact economic land use outcomes compared to the status quo? There are, when we look at the literature, we find that there's a lot of discussion about the need to figure out how to make communities more walkable, how to give people more mobility options, whether it's through bus service or in urbanized areas it could include rail service, like we've been expanding streetcar service in New Orleans, or the potential to connect New Orleans to Baton Rouge through intercity or commuter rail. And all of these discussions that we're having, I really believe, get to the heart of whether or not our economy will be desirable for companies and people to move. Tara and I were having a conversation as we were I hate to admit it, we're droving over from the other side of our campus to this side of the campus, because our campus isn't, I mean, it's not a bad campus, it's walkable, but you know, we don't have, and we don't have the land use patterns, you know, in these neighborhoods that are really conducive to a kind of a walkable or transit-friendly place. It's a drivable sort of an area, which is the case for 95% of the rest of the United States, so it's not unique in this country. But we were talking about how so many people are moving to Denver, Colorado, and young people are wanting to move there because they're building out these new rail systems, and the neighborhoods are thriving, and there's all sorts of, you know, mixed-use communities popping up around these transit stations, and you know, how you know, kind of Denver is really becoming a model. Now, New Orleans is also a place where a lot of people are moving because we do have these sorts of land use patterns, and they're historical patterns here. And you know, we've been able to have a lot of abandoned homes that have been renovated and gentrified in the last 10 years since Katrina, and people are moving into these neighborhoods. Property values are going up, businesses are opening, more people are biking, more people are walking, transit ridership is increasing, but you know, that works well for, you know, a street network like New Orleans, but what do we do, you know, in places that are growing, that are on the fringe of communities, like in Baton Rouge and Lafayette and Monroe and Shreveport and across the state? So how do we make ourselves to be a desirable community where the millennial generation wants to move in the future, where companies want to set up their headquarters? And how, as transportation professionals, do we consider the investment of infrastructure? And you know, because infrastructure, they said, what comes first? You know, do you build transportation infrastructure to encourage these more mixed-use, walkable communities, or do you create the mixed-use, walkable communities and then put in the infrastructure to serve that? And the reality is that you need both. You have to have plans and policies for both, and that's what really leads to our project goal of trying to create a blueprint for growth management to guide model policies at the state, MPO, parish, and municipal level in Louisiana. The methodology that we went through to answer some of these questions included 11 different tasks, so you can see why we'll have a lot here to present to you. And the first part of the project looked at the background and best practices and context. This included literature review, analysis of the legal framework that we did with Steve Villavasso, who's one of the leading planning attorneys in not just in the state, but in the country. I mean, he's on the president's, he's the chair, I think the chair of the President's Council for the American Planning Association. Then we looked at socio-demographic analysis. We did some polls at the state level. We had a bunch of stakeholder meetings across the entire state. We listed out a bunch of policies. We modeled some of those policies. We did a return on investment analysis, and then we put together some draft guidelines, and then we went back all across the state, met with all these stakeholders one more time, presented all of that to them, got their feedback, and then that led to our final report and blueprint policy. So I'm going to turn it over to Tara, who's going to talk about background, best practices, and context, and then I will come back a little bit later.
Okay, so the first step in the research, as with most research projects, we delved into the existing literature on growth management policy to get a handle on what we were talking about here. So we looked at the historic and current practices in statewide growth management policy. We explored some of the specific regulatory and incentive-based tools that are available to state as well as regional and local jurisdictions to plan for growth, particularly with respect to the development of the state's transportation network. So growth management is not necessarily about transportation. We confined our research to specifically looking at those portions of it which relate to transportation. We looked at state-level policies across the country to sort of find some of the key themes and commonalities among them, with a particular focus, where possible, on examples from other southern states, and states that have developed tools and strategies not just for urban areas, but who also were looking at their suburbs and their rural areas and trying to find tools that would work well for those as well. We found evidence then that state-level intervention and support is very frequently necessary in order to achieve the outcomes that local governments are looking for. And critically, there needs to be very strong interagency and interjurisdictional coordination, as well as very strong public and local support and buy-in in order to be successful with a growth management program of any kind. So identifying how to create policies and guidelines that create opportunities to make that happen, and ways that meet the specific needs of local jurisdictions, as well as advancing state goals and US DOT goals as well, was sort of the ultimate purpose of this project. So the literature review gave us sort of the foundation to build on from there. And the result of this review was to develop a comprehensive list of all of the relevant tools and policies, from technical assistance programs to concurrency requirements to complete streets to transfer of development rights, and many, many more such tools. And together these formed the foundation of a toolbox of ideas from which we were going to build our blueprint. This just shows you a sample of the first 10 or so of those relating to one aspect of growth management, access management. So for the next task, as John mentioned, we contracted with Steve Villavasso, planning law expert, to produce a state and parish level analysis of any current policies and relevant legal issues pertaining to growth management in Louisiana. So this included a comprehensive evaluation of exactly what types of planning and zoning regulation had been adopted or were in the process of being adopted, had been initiated in each municipality and parish throughout the state, and also what degree of transportation planning in particular was occurring. This also included the identification of what policies, if any, or tools that specifically relate to growth management had been implemented. So the previous list that we developed for the toolbox, we then looked to see where these things were actually happening in the state. So this portion of the project, in combination with the follow-up information from the stakeholder involvement, told us a lot more about the state of the practice in Louisiana at the local level and the current legal constraints that we need to be aware of as we're developing recommendations. And so the legal analysis revealed that 23 out of our 64 Louisiana parishes are actively engaged in some form of growth management planning. And we're defining that fairly loosely here as parishes that have parish-wide master planning and zoning, and also parishes where one or more of the municipalities within that parish have undertaken master planning and zoning on a level that's significant enough to affect the entire parish. And this map illustrates those 23 parishes that have got started on this process, basically. And the next, we found that many of the rural areas, as you can kind of see from the map, the more rural parts of the state do not have adopted master plans or land use regulations. And in particular here, we found that many lack parish level zoning. And there's often sort of a lack of interest in starting a process toward adopting zoning in these rural and sometimes suburban areas. And that could be a really significant challenge to some of the regulatory tools that we often used to preserve corridors, to manage the scale and the type of development that's going to occur along both existing and future rights-of-way. So the next task was to look closely at socioeconomic and demographic trends. In Louisiana, we were looking at census data as well as the Louisiana Parish Population Projection Series, looking out through 2030. And we looked at and mapped overall population change, which is, as you can see, quite variable throughout the state. This is the projected change from 2010 to 2030, with red being decreases and blue being increases. And we see that there are marked declines in populations expected in some of the parishes, and very large increases expected in some others in the blue and green colors. And we have found that rapid growth in these areas is creating infrastructure pressures, while in other areas where there is a declining population, the primary concern is more likely going to be maintaining the infrastructure that we already have with declining tax bases going into the future. We also looked at the current and future age cohort breakdown of Louisianans, because factors like the number of children, the number of seniors, the number of young adults in a community is going to have a big impact on how we need to plan the communities and transportation networks for the future. So we looked at how households are changing overall, with a trend, as we've seen nationwide, towards smaller families, more single-person households, and looking also a little bit at how racial and ethnic trends are shifting slightly to just having overall greater diversity in the state. We also looked at income, poverty, education, employment, homeownership rates, vacancy rates, cost of living as benchmarked by the percentage of income that is spent on housing costs. And we found some pretty unsurprising correlations here between population change and with some of these indicators of economic well-being, suggesting that many communities in Louisiana are going to be facing challenges to provide and maintain their infrastructure in the coming years again. So one outcome of this project, hopefully, is to provide a little bit of guidance for communities to make sure that they can make the most of their limited resources by keeping new infrastructure costs down and leveraging the resources that we have in areas that are already developed. We also looked at employment trends in the state by sector and industry, various transportation characteristics, including mode of transportation to work, vehicles available, as this map illustrates, travel time, time of departure for work. In some of the parishes, we've seen active transportation is definitely becoming a more significant component of residents' work commutes, and those figures, while they're still pretty small, are increasing. And also of note, in 22 Louisiana parishes, we found that more than 10% of households do not have vehicle access, which potentially limits their employment opportunities if you don't have transportation alternatives other than driving. So all of this data then just fed into our final analysis of what opportunities exist to make policy changes now that are going to prepare communities for the future in the face of demographic change, lifestyle changes, and whether that means very rapid growth or a declining population or an aging population or more demand for walking, biking, and transit. So the next phase of the research, once we got that sort of basic background out of the way, was to actually go to work collecting data from the public and also from stakeholders who were involved in land use and transportation directly, and we did that in a couple of ways. The first was, as John mentioned, we conducted a couple of online polls. One was for local and regional government personnel mostly. This included planners, engineers, other professionals who have some sort of interest in or knowledge of transportation issues. And that was a poll that was looking closely at the existing policies within agencies, looking at levels of support for specific elements of growth management, and looking at the priorities and concerns across regions and also for the state as a whole. The second poll was for the general public. We got that out there through a handful of media outlets throughout the state. And that was aimed at getting a sense of the sort of general transportation priorities that residents of Louisiana currently have. And for the state as a whole, looking at sort of top goals for the state, the role of local government, and also transportation funding. And that poll, we ended up getting 557 responses. They came from 35 parishes. We took that poll response and we weighted it to adjust for gender as well as racial parity, so it lined up with state demographics. The Stakeholder Survey, we had 67 respondents from all regions of the state representing a wide variety of different types of entities. So the key findings from the public poll included a clear support for increasing multimodal transportation options as a means to mitigate congestion moving forward rather than expanding highways. We also found that transportation choice is a clear priority for many Louisiana residents, along with using transportation as an economic driver, creating jobs, and maintaining our existing infrastructure, where those are the top three priorities. Importantly, we also found that the majority of Louisianans would support increased taxes or fees in order to support transportation of all kinds. In particular, public transit had the highest percentage of respondents who said that they would pay more in taxes in order to support better public transit. We also asked some questions about the role of local government in planning in relation to managing growth. Found that the overwhelming majority of respondents do think that local governments should be required to develop transportation plans, should embrace a multimodal approach to transportation, should regulate land use in order to manage growth specifically, and also should require developers to mitigate any traffic impacts that are caused by new development. So overall, in this poll, we found that Louisiana residents would prefer investment in multimodal transportation and in maintenance rather than new road construction. They would support local planning and land use regulation, and they do want more choices for how to get around their communities and are willing to consider new revenue sources in order to address those needs. On the other side, with the stakeholder survey, this really gave us a lot of detailed information about what specific regions and specific agencies are up to, which then was very helpful moving forward when we went into those meetings. It also helped us to draw some sort of general conclusions about the state. So for example, our survey revealed that the priorities of different types of communities, urban, suburban, and rural, sometimes differed. In urban areas, complete streets emerged as a major concern time and time again, as was freight movement, indicating sort of the challenge of accommodating a lot of different types of users in a limited space that's already, for the most part, built out. In suburban areas, growth and development were the top priorities, specifically minimizing new greenfield sprawling development by directing any new growth into existing communities. And from rural respondents, we saw a little bit of both, the need to manage new development and also the presumed economic imperative to move freight and goods through the state. So we asked about which of a variety of growth management strategies, we put out a list of them, and we asked which ones respondents' agencies would most support, and found there that requiring developers to mitigate impacts, again, emerged very high, as well as increasing sort of the overall transparency and the consistency and predictability of development decisions. Also, more involvement of community members and stakeholders, and steering growth toward existing communities were the top responses. So we also found that while many respondents indicated that they are utilizing various tools that relate to growth management, things that would have appeared on that toolbox list of all the possible tools, they don't necessarily consider that their agency has adopted a growth management approach overall, doesn't have any sort of defined growth management policy, that's not necessarily on the radar. And this indicates that it might be very valuable here to demonstrate the links between some of the tools that folks are already using and how that impacts growth management, what the benefits are that can result to help local governments better understand how to achieve their local land use and transportation goals. We found too that MPOs are widely seen as being very critical links to creating policy consistency, both across levels of government, from state to local, and also among neighboring jurisdictions. However, most MPOs in Louisiana reported not having really explicitly integrated these tools and policies into their procedures and their operations. And finally, and very unsurprisingly, we found that a lack of political support for growth management policy and also developer opposition to regulation generally were the key impediments identified throughout the state.